The Great War, and simply referred to as the War, was a pivotal event in the setting of the Fallout series, a global thermonuclear exchange that took place on Saturday, October 23, 2077, as a result of the then ongoing Sino-American War between China and the United States of America. It resulted in the destruction of all participating nations and abroad, global disruption of the climate, and billions of casualties as a result of nuclear blasts, exposure to radiation, and the subsequent collapse of social and government structures, all within the span of just 2 hours. The landscape of the United States and the rest of the world were transformed into a wasteland, and even 200 years later, the consequences of the Great War can still be felt in the form of lingering radiation, sickness, and disease, mutated monsters, environmental degradation, and scarce resources resulting in violent lawlessness. The nuclear holocaust was a direct result of the decade-long conflict that left both the United States and China exhausted. By 2077, a combination of attrition, loss of supply routes, and offensives conducted by the United States across the front left Chinese units in Alaska stranded and cut off from reinforcements. The liberation of Anchorage, spearheaded by winterized T-51 power armor units under the command of General Constantine Chase, marked the end of the Battle of Anchorage after a decade of war. The campaign in mainland China, which began in 2074 and included deployments in Shantou, was reinvigorated by gaining ground in Alaska and the deployment of T-51 units. However, as American soldiers pushed deeper into the mainland, Chinese resistance increased. By October, the situation transitioned from a rout into a stalemate. Despite a decade of war, there was no end in sight. Billions of dollars and thousands of casualties were spent in vain, despite taxes and various wartime revenues ensuring the federal government was able to fund a standing army, the likes of which the United States had never seen before. In a desperate attempt to bolster the offensive and break the stalemate, bases across the United States were sealed and troops were redeployed. The situation was made worse by the fact that the oligarchs ruling the United States retreated to remote locations around the globe, expecting a last-ditch nuclear strike from China at any moment. The oil rig off the Californian coast was claimed by the president and key members of the junta, a group which would later become the foundation of the enclave. The United States was leaderless, continuing on simply due to inertia. In 2065, Robert House arrived at the conclusion that a nuclear war was inevitable by 2080 or sooner. By 2077, Voltec had begun stating the likelihood of nuclear war occurring by the year 2080 had been calculated to be the staggering odds of 17,443,762 to 1. The corporation had been scheming with other entities, such as Robco and Big MT, to finance their vaults and firmly establish a monopoly. To this end, they offered to initiate a nuclear blast to kick off the Great War so as to ensure their investment would pay off, and eventually their experiments and individuals within the vaults would be able to take control of the surface, though it is not known if they ever had the chance to follow through on such a provocation. The war both began and ended on Saturday, October 23, 2077. Unknown submersible objects were sighted at 003 EST off the coast of California by the United States Pacific Fleet. At 3:37 EST, a squadron of high-altitude bombers were sighted off the Bering Strait and believed to be Chinese. At least one Chinese stealth submarine, the Yangtze, moved close to the American East Coast, launching all warheads, save for one, due to a malfunction. 6 hours later, at 9:13 EST, the Integrated Operational Nuclear Detection System detected the first 4 missile launches, and the United States went to DEFCON 2. 4 minutes later, NORAD confirmation sealed the fate of the world. At 9:26 EST, the President ordered a retaliatory strike according to scenario MXCN-91. Nuclear bombs hit Pennsylvania and New York at 9:42 EST, followed by the West Coast immediately after. The bombs continued to drop, and 5 minutes later, at 9:47 EST, Washington DC was hit and most American facilities went offline. The nuclear exchange continued for 2 hours. Both China and the United States suffered catastrophic losses. The standard nuclear warhead used in the Great War was that of a strategic nuclear warhead ranging from 200 to 750 kilotons in explosive yield, with high yield variants found on Chinese submarines. This was actually far worse for the Earth, as the lower yield warheads deposited more soil and debris into the lower atmosphere, resulting in a much more concentrated fallout that eventually enveloped the planet. The entire world was blanketed with multiple nuclear strikes, and the world and its entire ecosystem were irrevocably changed for centuries to come. The beginning of Fallout 4 establishes the precise time frame of the Great War. The game starts out in pre-war Boston in the morning, only moments before the bombs fall, showing that the Great War occurred at 9:47 AM Eastern Time. New York and Pennsylvania were hit at 9:42 AM, with Boston and Washington DC being hit at 9:47 AM, 5 minutes after. This time was first presented in Fallout 3, in which all clocks are stuck at 9:47, and Carrie Delaney's recordings from Early Dawn's Saturday trip to Little Lamplight. The same clocks were also reused in the Fallout New Vegas add-on Honest Hearts, even with the same hour, despite being in a time zone 2 hours behind the East Coast. This is more than likely an oversight when reusing assets. A ghoul, Carol, who recollects her survival of it to the player, claims that the West Coast had been hit prior to DC, and that an amount of time passed between the two, which allowed news to reach them, prompting them to enter fallout shelters. The time frame has been consistently maintained in subsequent games. For example, a terminal in the Palace of the Winding Path in Fallout 76 states, a group of technicians saw bright lights on the horizon and clouds of fire in the sky during the morning of October 23rd, with one exception. The opening narration in the Fallout New Vegas add-on, Old World Blues, states the bombs fell during the night. However, by 9:47 AM Eastern, dawn has already broke across the contiguous United States. This is the only exception, as in Fallout New Vegas. Mr. House says that the Platinum chip was to be delivered in the afternoon of October 23rd, but by then, the world had ended. The results of the Great War were devastating, as they combined with biological and chemical weapons that saw widespread use during the Sino-American War. The changes in climate led to widespread alterations of the ecosystem. The new climate meant that many plants could no longer grow or be cultivated, ranging from common vegetables to specialized crops, such as coca plants or opium poppies. Due to necessity, crop variants mutated by radiation were adopted by survivors, including mutated cabbage and maize. These cultivars thrived in the warm weather of the southwest, with similar mutations proliferating across the colder climates of the northern reaches of the continent. Animals were also adversely affected. The combination of radioactive fallout and various local mutagens, particularly the forced evolutionary virus in New California, led to widespread genetic mutation. By 2080, new species were created almost overnight, replacing animals that had gone extinct or been outcompeted. One mutated species to emerge from this melting pot of genotypes is the Brahmin, a mutated cattle variant. Once the mutation stabilized, the Brahmin turned out to be well suited for the harsh conditions of the wasteland, requiring little water and relatively small grazing areas, while providing plenty in return, including milk, meat, leather, bone, transportation. As such, it rapidly became the most widespread livestock animal in New California, and the backbone of many a wasteland economy. The impact on humanity and civilization was painfully severe and traumatic. In the immediate chaos that ensued after the bombings, people began fighting each other for resources and what little shelter remained intact. Many survivors would then divide themselves into ragtag communities, tribes, and/or various gangs of unscrupulous raiders. Diseases and illness became widespread, largely caused by the radiation. Although emergency response units and elements of the National Guard were mobilised on the evening of October 22nd, their ability to provide aid to victims and refugees was severely hampered by the lack of any centralised command and control, resulting from electromagnetic pulses which disabled most communications equipment. Despite efforts by the military to bolster relief efforts, the shock of the nuclear attack resulted in their morale crumbling and many deserting their posts. By the time radiation sickness began to set in among victims of the attack, The situation had already become hopeless as they were no longer receiving any supplies with which to aid the victims. Whiskey and painkillers were the only care available to most patients. Those who lived outside of major cities or managed to escape them in the narrow window of time granted by the sirens faced a much better chance of survival. However, one exception of Las Vegas was spared a direct nuclear strike thanks to Robert House, who disabled or destroyed 68 out of the 77 warheads heading for the city. Although suffering from the sudden loss of access to water, food, and medical care, these survivors went on to found new communities across the newly born wasteland, becoming the founding fathers of a new civilization struggling to rise from the ashes. These included Darkwater, the founder of Junktown, Angus of the Hub, the founders of Megaton and Diamond City. Some of the less fortunate survivors on the surface turned into ghouls, a result of their exposure to radioactive fallout and/or thermal radiation from the blasts, with their horrifying appearance leading to a kind of racial prejudice among other human survivors. Just a side note, I cover ghouls in depth in another video that you can watch after this one and will be linked at the end. A relative few were able to reach safety in underground vaults constructed by the Vault-Tec Corporation at the behest of the federal government. Some refused to go into their assigned vaults, believing that it was all just another drill, not realizing the truth of their situation until it was far too late. Vaults that didn't fail as a result of their experiments frequently became another source of civilization across the wasteland, such as Vault 15, whose inhabitants founded the village of Shady Sands, as well as the raider tribes of the Khans, the Vipers, and the Jackals. The Los Angeles Vault, which led to the establishment of Adidum, and Vault 8, which led to the establishment of Vault City. Although the war ended within a single day, remnants of the American government and military had made contingency plans and attempted to follow through on retaliatory strikes, with many in the enclave retreating to safety in their bunkers. In Appalachia, cut off from the rest of the enclave, former Secretary of Agriculture Thomas Eckhart wanted to continue the Great War and launch further nuclear strikes against China in retaliation. This required a threat escalation to access the nuclear silo's automated systems, and Eckhart's actions to do so resulted in the Scorched Plague in Appalachia, as well as a small-scale civil war and complete destruction of the enclave in the region. Apart from the enclave, other general contingency plans were believed to exist in the US military. Non-enclave military units also continued to function for a brief period, enforcing evacuations of military personnel and assets, as well as attempting to maintain martial law in locations such as Boston, while other surviving government units such as Response Unit MD 478 of the National Catastrophe Relief Auxiliary also attempted to provide humanitarian aid before eventually falling apart. Any contingency plans made by other nations, including China, are currently unknown. However, in the United States, surviving Chinese military assets continued to function in the aftermath of the Great War, thanks to an extensive infiltration campaign, as well as the use of long-range nuclear submarines. These assets were cut off from their homeland, but under communist dogma, continued their final orders regardless. Many were turned into ghouls, such as the remnants of the Mama Dulce's factory in Washington, D.C., or the Fujinia intelligence base in Appalachia. One group operating in a nuclear submarine, however, decided to integrate into wasteland life, forming the She in San Francisco. The weapons of the Great War would continue to ravage the wasteland for decades and centuries afterwards. Most vehicles were left to rust and fell into disuse shortly after the Great War. The main exception to this were vertibirds used primarily by the Enclave, but later by other factions that won them off of the Enclave. Caches of small arms belonging to both the American and Chinese militaries would be uncovered and used by wastelanders and factions all across the former USA. Military-grade robots such as Mr. Gutsy's still prowl the wasteland, the majority of their programming having gone haywire and making them hostile to all life. Of the suits of power armour left behind, some were repurposed by small-scale raider gangs, but they would be used mostly by the Brotherhood of Steel, who tracked them down whenever they could, and used them as the foremost weapon in their arsenal. Finally, nuclear proliferation would persist even after the Great War, as a number of unexploded nuclear bombs remained. The settlement of Megaton was built around an unexploded bomb that could still be detonated with enough tampering. The nuclear arsenals in Appalachia and the Divide remained stocked and would be detonated after the Great War. Other facilities, such as Sentinel Site Prescott in the Commonwealth, also retained their arsenals. Only a few decades after the war, the nations that were involved and the ideological justifications were being forgotten as the survivors had to deal with present reality, and the legacies of destroyed nations ceased to matter. Only the Enclave would truly carry on the Great War's jingoistic legacy. Thanks for sticking around to the end, and I hope you enjoyed this video on Fallout's Great War. Shout out to my subs, and hope to see you in the next video.